Hello everybody and welcome back. Now the topic of today's video is the aims and results of policies towards minorities. Now just to preface, this video will be a pretty extensive video, a pretty long video, because there are a lot of things we need to talk about, a lot of components we need to dissuade, a lot of misinformation that we need to wade through in order to really dig into and approach this with absolute sincerity and authenticity. What we're actually going to be focusing on today is policies towards multiple minorities, and that's something that is kind of the first thing we need to talk about. Today we're going to talk about two major examples. We're going to talk about the T4 program, also known as the euthanasia program. And we're also going to talk about the Holocaust. But the thing that we need to approach with the Holocaust is when we often think about the Holocaust, we think about the impact on Jewish individuals. And we tend to forget that there are a lot of people who were struck down. And there's a reason why we forget that. It isn't some sort of biases or anything like that, but there's a huge issue that is prevalent when the Holocaust is usually taught. So I hope to dissuade any of that misinformation, and I hope to have you all research or inspire you to research more about the extent of what the Nazis did to minorities. In fact, this picture here is a picture of a group of people who were also attacked during the Holocaust. The Romani people. They were nomadic individuals. Some of them are nomadic, some are not. Who settled in Europe, but were seen as just as racially impure. But we'll get into that as we go. The first example we're going to dig in today is the T4 program. Now, the T4 program was dedicated to attacking what the Nazi government deemed as defectives. And before the T4 program started, the Nazi government started rounding up the people who we will, in a little bit, talk about as the defectives, and started sterilizing them. The first attack was to go through and sterilize anybody who suffered from mental illness, or anyone who had possibly a deformity, or a severe enough genetic medical issue. They went around to asylums and hospital records to find out who was part of what they deemed defective, and essentially took them from their homes, arrested them, under the guise that they needed medical treatment, to sterilize them. And the way they did this between 33 and 39, which is before the T4 program, was propaganda like you see here, where they would push that the people who were defective, the people who were getting paid money by the government to help just exist, were seen as burdens on the government. And this propaganda really pushed on the notion that the people of Germany are supporting and being burdened by those who cannot produce, that those who are not effective individuals. And so the idea was, if we eliminate them in terms of them having to reproduce, if we get that genetic material out of the genetic pool, then there'll be less defective Aryan people. But by 1939, we had about 350,000 defective individuals who were sterilized. But that was not enough for the government. They wanted to push the envelope more. They wanted to see just how far they can give this. So in September 1939, Hitler issued an order to round up anybody who was defective once again. Those who were suffering from epilepsy, deaf, blind, mental disability, physical disability, to get them together, round them all up, and to start euthanizing them, to start killing them. And this time, when they were euthanizing these individuals, it was under the guise that they needed help. They needed specific care, and we're going to take them. The Nazi government told the parents, told the siblings, told the children in some cases, that we're going to take you to a mental hospital to help you, to get you some treatment and have the government help out. And they were taken to essentially facilities that had gas chambers, where they would fill gas chambers with carbon dioxide until they stopped breathing, and slowly started killing and murdering any of these defective people. What makes the T4 program really significant is in 1939, this happens the same month that World War II breaks out. So as Germany has invaded Poland, his government is rounding up people like this, and has started killing his own people because of that, because of a defective disorder. Now, the issue with this was a lot of people objected to this. A lot of people were really upset by this. And word got out of what was happening. So between 39 and 41, the program suffered a lot of issues from the people. Churches came out and protested the government. People were making and showing awareness to this, and really like, hey, look what they're doing. They're killing these people. And the pressure by the public to stop this got so great that in 41, they ended up stopping the program. And it was the only time we saw a lot of German people coming together to stop the program by the government. But what we know was that the T4 program became a test for the Holocaust, became a test for what Germany really wanted to do, became a test for the eventual widespread death that we're going to hear about in the next slide. And although people did resist, anybody who was too loud-spoken, anyone who was too much of a pain for the German government, they would somehow mysteriously end up gone or missing. And in some cases, there was a very famous bishop, a Catholic bishop, who was sent to a concentration camp for protesting one of these T4 facilities in his town. And overall, this shows a really interesting push of what the Nazi government wanted to do and how much they were willing to push. And this is where we get to the Holocaust. Now, we're going to start this by getting rid of some misunderstandings. So, when we talk about the Holocaust, there are two stages to it. There's multiple stages to it, but there are two big ones that we're going to need to focus on just for right now. That's from 1933 to 1939, and then 1939 to 1945. Between 33 and 39, it's the persecution of Jewish minorities, as well as many other people. Now, from 39 to 45, this is where we enter into what is deemed the Holocaust, what is deemed the final solution, where the Jewish individuals were then taken from a status of just being maintained until they died on their own to actively killing them. Now, a lot of the times when we talk about the Holocaust, we almost exclusively talk about the Jewish minority. We don't talk about the other minorities. And there's a reason for that. Because the word, the Holocaust, exclusively is talking about the Jewish individuals who were killed and murdered by the Nazi government. The Holocaust refers exclusively to that area. But they were not the only individuals who were killed. We know this. But how much of it do we actually know? That when we talk about the Holocaust, we're talking about at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 groups of individuals, of peoples, based off of the different areas. And this list right here, this graph, is not even talking about the Jewish individuals. If you notice, there's no yellow star. There are 7 different colors. So who do these colors stand for? The first was labeled for Black Germans, of which 30,000 were killed or sterilized during the same time period. The Black Germans wore this right here, a black triangle. The next group was Freemasons, a group of individuals who came together. They're an organization who promotes help in the community, but they're also very secretive. And because of their secrecy, we don't know how many were actually killed of these individuals. There were German citizens, Jewish people. Anyone can be a Freemason, any male. But we do know that they were captured and killed and put in camps, not only because of records from the Holocaust, but also from people who were Masons. They wore a gray one right here that was reserved for political prisoners. The next group was homosexuals. Anybody who was part of the homosexual community was rounded up, put into a camp, and by the time of the Holocaust, also killed and exterminated, just like the Jewish individuals. They wore the pink triangle, which is also why, if you notice, the LGBTQ civil rights movement, the pink triangle is a symbol for that because of what they suffered in the Holocaust. Another group was the Jehovah's Witnesses. The Jehovah's Witnesses, as a religious minority, were one of the few who not only advocated against the Nazis, but did motions to fight against them. They wore this purple one. The Catholic bishop who was sent to the concentration camp for protesting the T4 program, he wore this purple one. Then we have the mentally disabled. The mentally disabled, we had about 360,000 sterilized. And of those 360,000, 250,000 we know for sure were killed in the Holocaust. That number could be higher, the number could be lower. And more onto why not lower, it can be definitely higher. And more on that in a little bit. And the second largest group of individuals killed in the Holocaust, who we don't really talk about much, are the Roma. The Roma people, was that picture of the woman at the very beginning, between 200 and 500,000 of them were killed. They wore red, green, and black, depending on how they were categorized. These groups, and if you notice, some of these weren't talked about, like the blue is anyone who was an immigrant or a prisoner of war, wore those. So when we're talking about the Holocaust, we're talking about the things that we're going to move on in the next slide. You do need to keep in mind that these points, these parts, are also a part of these individuals. They were being called in, they were being attacked and ushered in the same time as Jewish people. It's not that they were rounded up towards the end. It's that as the Holocaust was occurring for the Jewish individuals, these people were also suffering just as much. Now, before I start digging into the 2 more prefaces, the first being the reason why some of these numbers are so large, but also why I mentioned that we're not 100% sure, is because towards the end of the war, as the Soviet forces were coming close, as the British forces, American and French forces, the Death Heads Division, who was in charge of the Holocaust, sometimes they were able to get information or reconnaissance of how close the invading army was. And with enough time, they were able to go through and kill everyone who was in the camp and forever destroy and hide any instance of these camps. Because it was not good. Like, of course they're going to try to hide it. And so we are still finding concentration camps to this day. We are still finding archaeological finds of some camps that were almost forgotten. And as we find those, our numbers get more and more accurate. This is where we get to, like, the most recent camp was found, I believe, in 2009, 2015. It was one of those 2 years. And when we think of the Holocaust, make sure to remember that a lot of what we see is heavily lensed through either anti-Semitism or as a way of changing or eliminating people's history, such as the Romana, the Freemasons, the Black Germans, the homosexuals, the Jehovah's, and the mentally disabled. I would greatly encourage you, if you ever do any research into the Holocaust on your own, to start with Holocaust Museum websites. Start with the people and how and where they recommend, because that is where you will find some of the most accurate information. There's also books out there that are very good for it, like this book right here, A Convenient Hatred, The History of Anti-Semitism, is an amazing book for anti-Semitism in Europe, but also for the Holocaust. Now, in order to understand the Holocaust, we need to understand that Germany went through several phases in their role. Nazi Germany went through several time periods where they started building up and building and building and building and building to get to these numbers, to get to this horrific atrocity. And so in the next slide, each point is going to be a year, and I'm going to talk about what was happening in that year that started building up. So let's go ahead and start talking about that. The first policy that was enacted was in 1933. As soon as the Nazi Party came into power in 1933, the Nazi government outlawed any Jewish individual from holding political office. They outlawed anybody from participating in the government, participating in any matter of business that held themselves over Germans. And so in 1933, from the beginning, they're not outright attacking the full community. They're only attacking politicians and starting to attack businessmen. And with that, there's a lot of propaganda to justify what they are doing. And a lot of this propaganda comes down to the protocols of the Elders of Zion, as we heard very long ago. And between 33 and 35, which is the next entry point, there is a slower burning buildup with 34, with the Reich Press Law being passed, and the elimination of any Jewish newspapers and news agencies. But then in 35, there's the huge hit of the Nuremberg Race Law, where now Germany made it illegal for anyone to intermarry, as we talked about, revoking Jewish citizenships. But also in 1935 is when they start the migration and labeling of Jewish individuals in Germany, where you have to walk outside with the star that we so often see. And by the end of 1935, they start the program of relocating Jewish communities into ghettos, into a whole new system that they created of a slum. And between 35 and 38, violence towards Jewish businesses, Jewish companies, and Jewish individuals start building and building and building, but coming to a major head in 1938. In 1938, there started to be major relocation of Jewish individuals and relocation of entire Jewish communities into camps, into concentration camps where massive neighborhoods were disappearing. But because of the segregation between 35 and 38, it was really easy for them to disappear. Then there was an event, a very famous event, called Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. And in 1938, because of the death of a German citizen, allegedly at the hands of a Jewish individual, there was a riot against and towards Jewish communities, where, very similar to the Night of the Long Knives in the Night of Broken Glass, this riot came through where essentially some members of the SS, some members of what's left of the SA, and the tradition and the normal German population went through and started burning down Jewish buildings, breaking into people's homes, beating people up, as long as they were labeled as Jewish. Or we had a night of just massive violence against this community, against the Romani, against the Black Germans, against a lot of these individuals, because now they were being seen as the enemy of the country. Propaganda has started to fully come into place, where now people are not just impartial to the laws that happen to Jewish communities, but now in favor of laws that are hurting Jewish communities. Then we get to 1939. And in 1939, under the attack of the T4 program, at the start of the T4 program, the Jewish communities get fully relocated into concentration camps. So at this point now, as the German forces cross into Poland, as they start crossing across Europe, camps are starting to pop up with the new governments. So the Polish government, for instance, they put up concentration camps to abide to the Nazis. And they reported their own individuals. And by the end of 39, there were multiple camps set up across Germany. And suddenly, seemingly, there was less and less members of the Jewish community that the German population stopped paying attention to, because now we're at war. And so between 39 and 42, there was almost a great silence in the country, as no one was really preoccupied or cared. There was always Jewish propaganda. There was always propaganda, anti-Semitic propaganda, but it wasn't very big. And then, in the middle of this, the T4 program ends. And when the T4 program ends, the German government, the Nazi German government, realizes just how far they can push things, just how far they can really push this execution that they want to push. And this is where we get to at the beginning of 1942, as the German army starts suffering from the war, as they start realizing that winning the war is going to be really difficult and it's not going to be quick, that, hey, let's get women in, let's do this, let's do that. Let's stop spending resources on these communities that we hate. And that is where we enter the last stage, between 42 and 45. This stage is called the final solution. And over the course of 42 to 45, concentration camps from the Soviet Union, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, France, Italy, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Belgium, Luxembourg, Africa and North Africa and Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Algeria. There is a order that goes through to commit the final solution. And between 42 and 45 is where all of those numbers that I listed off before this slide, they start to die and they start to perish. And by 45, roughly, and again, this is not a concrete number because we are still missing information and evidence, but at minimum, 6 million Jewish individuals are killed. And by 45, but towards the end of 45, towards the middle of 45, when the Allied forces successfully conquer, is when we start to learn about the concentration camps. In fact, the first army to learn about the concentration camps was in 1944, and it was the Soviet Union. They learned about it on the Eastern Front. And then the French had whispers, the British had whispers, but no actual evidence until late 1944, and the Americans and the British and French forces found camps. And that is how we learned about that. But prior to this, we knew that the Germans were violating human rights of multiple minorities, but we didn't know the full extent. And we should have, based off of the T4 program.